Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. So we've been living in our tiny house, in our little caravan, for about 3 years now. So we thought it was about time for us to give you some pros and some cons about tiny living, on whether or not it's right for you, and basically just our opinion on it. Like, do we enjoy it even, and do we think it's worth it? So tiny living's gonna look different for everyone depending on a couple of things like what your budget is, where you live in the world, and also kind of what you expect of it. So these things will kind of differ, but we'll still try and make it as general as possible. For us, the best option was to live in a caravan, and it's worked out really well for us. I mean, there's many different other options that people have used, from container houses to just generally smaller homes, or living on the road in a van or in an RV or something like that. But the caravan was just the best option for us. So let's get into it.
Zashi, yeah. Hey, puppy. Hey.
Okay, so first pro is it can be pretty cheap to do tiny living. I mean, cheap is a very relative term, but let's not use the term cheap, let's rather use more affordable. So for us, we got a caravan, and that was definitely more affordable for our situation in the area that we live, but that might differ from place to place all over the world, and what exactly you expect your tiny house being capable of providing for you. But I mean, other than that, we had to do pretty much everything ourselves, all the renovations in the caravan, all of putting water, electricity, everything else like that. We had to do all ourselves, and also acquiring a lot of the tools and different things like that to do all of that can also be quite expensive. But at the end of the day, it is more than likely, depending on the situation, going to work out more affordable than building a bigger place, obviously, or having somebody build you a bigger place. And at the end of the day, a house is just a shelter. It's just there to provide you a little bit of comfort and protection from the elements. And that's actually a good segue for the second pro. So the second thing is that it encourages outdoor living, really. Because your space, your living space, is so much smaller, you have so much more room to spare on the outside. Now for us, yes, that means we live on a farm. It's quite different than living in town. But if you think about it, and this only really applies if there aren't special restrictions to the way you can build your buildings where you live, but if you have a plot of land and you build your house only really as big as you need it to be, your garden becomes bigger, your outdoor space becomes bigger, and you can kind of live in nature, even in a more urban setting. I mean, Bertie, our caravan, is only about 2.5 meters by 6 meters, so we had to build this little wraparound deck all the way around to give us a little bit more outdoor space, a little bit more seating space outside, and that's made a really big difference for us to be able to have this outdoor space to just sit and have a cup of tea in the morning. Because at the end of the day, that's where you sleep. The rest of the area is where you spend most of your day, hopefully. And even more so if you have a job. If you have a job, you only really sleep there and maybe cook some meals. So it really doesn't need to be this massive house for you to just take up space and spend money on. These are called crossberries or kruisbessies in Afrikaans. They're indigenous to South Africa, and when they get to a nice golden color like this, you know they're ready for eating. But you also need to watch out. They have lots of little pips in them, 4 little pips in them, and yeah, so don't bite down too hard.
Zashi, let's go swim. Let's go swim. Come on, let's go.
Okay, so let's talk about the cons of tiny living, because there's definitely a few. Sorry, I wrote this down, the list. So the first thing, which is pretty obvious, is the tinier your house is, the more limited your space is. And with limited space, you're obviously going to have a lot of storage challenges, which has probably been our biggest challenge living in a tiny house, is coming up with creative solutions with where to store your stuff. And now obviously you can scale down your clothes and the amount of things that you have, but we have found that there's only that much you can really get rid of. And especially for someone like me that likes to do all the projects myself, a lot of DIY stuff, all the building myself, that kind of leaves you with the question of where am I going to put all my tools and all the building equipment. And so we've had to be very creative with that. And the one thing I never thought of living on a farm or in a tiny house is that you actually definitely need a shed to put everything into. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, but to me it didn't seem very obvious at the point, so that's something we need to build for the next thing. Now the next con is privacy issues. There can be major privacy issues with living in such a tiny space. So it's definitely not for everyone, and if you are living with a family member or a partner in such a tiny space, I think it can definitely wear on the relationship. Luckily for Jessie and I, it hasn't really been an issue, but I can definitely see how that would affect other relationships. There are times though, for example, when I'm editing a video or something and I'm still quite uncomfortable with talking into a microphone, doing voiceovers like that. It would be very nice to have your own space, you know, to do that editing. And in a small space like that, it just isn't an option. So you can offset something like that with having separate rooms in your tiny home, but there still definitely is some privacy limitations with living in such a small space, especially as small as ours. And the last thing is that there's actually a really big lifestyle adjustment. So what I mean by that is that if you are somebody like Jessie, for example, that really enjoys hosting people and having people over for a dinner or a braai, then your options become a little bit more limited, because you might not feel you have the space to be able to accommodate all the people that you want to invite over, which is very much the situation we find ourselves at the moment. Or even in the case of us having a compost toilet. Not a lot of people have experiences with people that exclusively use compost toilets, so you kind of have this need to explain to them how the compost toilet works, which is also kind of weird, and maybe your compost toilet system isn't working as well, so now you also kind of feel embarrassed to invite people over because of that. So there's obviously a lot of lifestyle adjustments that you need to be aware of for downscaling the size of your house to such an extent. But now that you've heard all my pros and cons, let's run it back a bit and actually think a little bit about what I said. So if you've been listening carefully, you would have noticed that I've actually mentioned more cons than I've listed pros, which is weird. And I tried for a very long time. I racked my brain to come up with more pros. I really couldn't. I could actually come up with a lot more cons than I could with pros for tiny living, which I don't really understand. I'm overall enjoying living in such a small space. It's been great for me. It's been great for Jessie and I. And yeah, I don't know, I can't explain it, it's an enigma, that's my brain. So the main thing I want to get across to everyone is, often with these kinds of things, people that do tiny living, they do minimalism, or they do living off-grid or anything like that, they make it seem like it's the answer, it's the solution to all of your problems, which in most cases it probably isn't. Things like that are lifestyle adjustments that would set you potentially on the right track for your solution. So for us, tiny living isn't the permanent answer. I could potentially do it for many more years to come. At this point, Jessie was really looking forward to potentially having a bit of a bigger space. So Bertie is definitely not going to be our forever home. But I mean, that's just the phase of life. We went into this thing as an adventure and we've enjoyed it. We don't know when it might change, but it probably will in the future. But that's not up to us either. You can only live life going forward, but it only makes sense in reverse. So that's all from me for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.
What's up? What's up, chicken? What's up?
Tiny living means a much smaller space. Wait for the wind.